I took the assignment at Tillamook Rock Lighthouse because I wanted to be the most isolated man on Earth, hiding from the world after a terrible loss. But on a foggy night in 1964, I heard a sound that froze my blood. Heavy, rhythmic scraping coming from the sheer vertical cliffs below the station. Before I share the secret I kept for 40 years, comment down below where you are watching this video from. And if you want to hear more true stories about the impossible encounters people have in the wild, please hit that subscribe button. This is the story of the visitor from the sea. My name is Thomas Brennan, and if the charts at the nurse's station are to be believed, I am 91 years old today. I'm sitting in a wheelchair by a window in a veteran's home in Astoria, Oregon, staring out at the same gray, churning ocean that defined my entire adult existence. They tell me I'm lucky to have this view, that it's a premium room, but they don't understand that the sea isn't scenery to me. It's a graveyard and a former employer. I spent 43 years watching that horizon, not from this soft chair, but from the iron gallery of Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, a basalt tomb a mile offshore. I am the last of the old breed, the wickies who trimmed the lamps and greased the gears before the computers took over and made us obsolete ghosts. Tillamook Rock, we called it Terrible Tilly, isn't like the picturesque lighthouses you see on postcards with wildflowers and picket fences. It is a jagged, hostile thumb of rock jutting out of the wildest stretch of the Pacific, constantly hammered by waves that can shatter the glass in the lantern room 100 feet up. It's a place where the wind screams like a banshee 20 hours a day, and the damp rots your boots off your feet in a month. I requested the posting in 1963 because it was the most isolated station in the Coast Guard's jurisdiction, a prison where I could serve a life sentence of my own making. I didn't go there to keep ships off the rocks. I went there because I couldn't stand to be on the mainland anymore. The reason for my exile is simple and terrible, the kind of tragedy that splits a man's timeline into before and after. My daughter Emma was 12 years old in the summer of 1962, a golden-haired girl who loved the water more than she loved the land. She took her small sailboat out on a clear July afternoon, chasing the wind, and a freak summer squall rolled in from the north with a violence that caught everyone off guard. I was on the dock, screaming for her to come about, but the whitecaps swallowed her little boat in seconds. We buried an empty casket 3 weeks later because the ocean never gave her back to me. After the funeral, the mainland became a suffocating landscape of pity and well-meaning platitudes that made me want to put a fist through a wall. People would stop me in the grocery store, gripping my shoulder with soft hands, telling me that time heals all wounds, or that she's in a better place. They wanted me to perform my grief for them, to cry and then recover, so they could feel better about the randomness of death. I couldn't do it. I couldn't pretend that the world made sense or that I would ever be whole again. I needed a place where no one would ask me how I was doing, where the noise of the world was drowned out by the roar of the water. So I transferred to Tillamook Rock, replacing a keeper who had gone mad from the isolation, stepping into his boots and his silence. The other two men on the rotation were quiet types, damaged in their own ways, and we learned to move around each other in the cramped quarters without speaking. But mostly, I volunteered for the night watches, the solitary shifts where it was just me, the Fresnel lens, and the infinite black dark. I found a strange comfort in the brutality of the rock, in the way the storms tried to scour us off the face of the earth. It felt like a punishment I deserved, a nightly penance for failing to save my child. Life on the rock was a grind of brass polish, diesel fumes, and the constant, rhythmic sweeping of the light beam across the water. You lose track of the days of the week, measuring time only by the logbook entries and the supply boat that came once a month if the seas allowed. I stopped reading newspapers, stopped listening to the radio, stopped caring about presidents or wars or the price of gas. The human world shrank down to a pinprick of light on the distant shore, a place I watched through binoculars but felt no connection to. I was becoming something else, something harder and colder, calcified by the salt spray like the rock itself. There were nights when the isolation played tricks on the mind, when the sound of the wind in the vents sounded like a girl's voice calling for help. I would stand on the gallery walkway, gripping the freezing iron railing, staring down into the black water until my eyes watered. I wasn't suicidal exactly, but I was waiting for the ocean to finish what it started, to reach up one night with a rogue wave and sweep me away to find her. I felt like a ghost haunting a machine, a hollow man keeping a light burning for ships I didn't care about. I thought I was alone in that feeling, the only sentient thing on that rock screaming into the void. But the ocean is full of secrets, and Tillamook Rock sits on the edge of a world that biology has barely scratched the surface of. I started noticing things that didn't fit the pattern of the usual wildlife. Seals that wouldn't come near the landing cove, seagulls that would suddenly take flight in the middle of the night for no reason. There were smells on the wind that weren't brine or dead fish, but something muskier, like wet dog and deep earth, a scent that shouldn't exist a mile offshore. I dismissed it as the hallucinations of a grieving mind, the neurons misfiring from lack of sleep and human contact. I didn't believe in monsters back then. I believed in tides, currents, and atmospheric pressure. I was a man of charts and gears, grounded in the mechanical reality of the lighthouse. If someone had told me that a Bigfoot, a creature of the deep forests, could swim a mile through freezing shark-infested waters to climb a vertical rock face, I would have laughed in their face. I thought the only things that climbed out of the sea were crabs and the occasional desperate seal fleeing a killer whale. I was arrogant in my despair, thinking I knew the limits of the world just because I had stopped caring about it. It was a Tuesday night in September of 1964 when my education began, 15 months into my self-imposed exile. The fog had rolled in thick, a wall of cotton that muffled the crash of the waves and turned the lighthouse beam into a solid shaft of yellow light. I was doing my midnight rounds, checking the pressure gauges on the foghorn machinery in the lower level, my wrench clanking against the pipes. Then I heard it. Not the wind, not the water, but a sound that didn't belong in the symphony of the storm. It was a scraping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the sheer basalt cliffs below the station, the sound of something heavy climbing up from the abyss. The fog that night was a living thing, a suffocating blanket that had erased the world beyond the glass of the lantern room. It was September 14th, 1964, a date burned into my memory with the precision of a laser. The beam of the Fresnel lens was struggling to punch through the mist, turning into a diffused, milky glow that illuminated nothing but the moisture in the air. I was down in the lower level, the belly of the beast, tending to the massive air compressors that powered the foghorn. The rhythmic chug-hiss of the machinery was the only sound I had heard for 6 hours, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the soles of my boots and settled into my teeth. I was wiping grease from a pressure valve with a rag, my mind drifting in the numb, neutral space I had cultivated since Emma died. The station felt secure, a fortress of iron and stone bolted to the rock, impervious to anything the Pacific could throw at it. But then, in the gap between the blasts of the horn, I heard it. It wasn't the crash of a wave or the cry of a gull. It was a scraping sound, sharp and distinctive. It sounded like metal dragging against basalt, or perhaps hard keratin finding purchase on the slick vertical walls of the cliff below the station. I froze, the rag hovering over the valve, waiting for the sound to repeat. Tilly is 100 feet of sheer, vertical rock rising out of deep water. Nothing climbs it. Seals haul out on the low rocks, but they don't scale the cliffs. I told myself it was driftwood being battered against the base by the swell, a log rhythmically striking the stone. But then it came again. Scritch, thud, grunt. It was the sound of effort. Something heavy was pulling itself up the face of the rock, defying gravity and the slime of the algae, moving closer to the gallery deck with every second. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the workbench, a reflex born of isolation rather than logic, and moved toward the heavy steel door that led to the lower catwalk. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a spike of adrenaline cutting through my fatigue. I wasn't afraid of ghosts. I was afraid of men. My first thought was a shipwreck survivor, some poor soul who had washed up and was clawing his way to salvation. Or worse, a boarder, someone crazy enough to swim out here. I threw the latch and pushed the door open, the damp, freezing air hitting me instantly. The fog outside was so thick I couldn't see the railing 5 feet away. I was stepping into a gray void. I gripped the cold iron of the walkway, leaning over the edge, straining to see down into the abyss below. The beam of the lighthouse swept overhead, a rhythmic pulse that momentarily lit up the mist, creating strobe light glimpses of the rocks below. Scrape, heave. The sound was directly beneath me now, close enough that I could hear the wet, heavy breathing of something exhausted. It wasn't the gasping of a man. It was the deep, cavernous lung capacity of a whale or a horse. Then a hand appeared over the edge of the landing platform, gripping the iron stanchion of the crane we used to haul supplies. I stared at it, my brain refusing to process the scale. It was massive, covered in dark, wet hair, with fingers the size of sausages and black, thick nails that dug into the metal. It wasn't a human hand, and it certainly wasn't a flipper. It looked like the hand of a drowned giant rising from the deep. I stepped back, the wrench slipping in my sweaty palm as the rest of the creature hauled itself up over the lip of the rock. It rolled onto the concrete platform, collapsing on its side, water pouring off its massive frame in gallons. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet long, a mountain of wet, matted fur that looked black in the dim light. It lay there heaving, coughing up seawater, its chest expanding and contracting with a violence that suggested it had swum a distance that should have been impossible. I stood frozen in the doorway, realizing that I wasn't looking at a shipwreck survivor. I was looking at something that biology said belonged in the deep woods, not a mile out to sea on a rock in the Pacific. The creature slowly pushed itself up to a sitting position, its movements heavy and stiff with cold. It shook its head, sending a spray of water flying, and wiped the brine from its eyes. When it looked up and saw me standing on the catwalk 10 feet above, it didn't roar. It didn't charge. It simply froze, locking its gaze onto mine. Its eyes were amber, reflecting the sweep of the lighthouse beam, filled with a terrifying, intelligent awareness. It looked shocked to see me, as if it had thought the rock was uninhabited, or perhaps it was just too tired to care. We stared at each other for a long minute, the fog swirling between us, the foghorn blasting its warning to ships that were miles away. I saw the shiver ripple through its body, the way it huddled into itself against the biting wind. It wasn't a monster attacking a castle. It was a refugee seeking high ground. It had swum through the freezing, shark-infested channel, fought the currents, and climbed a vertical wall just to find a dry spot to rest. The sheer physical feat was staggering, a testament to a survival instinct that bordered on the supernatural. It turned its head away from me, dismissing me as a threat, and curled up against the base of the fuel tank, seeking the residual heat of the metal. It tucked its knees to its chest, wrapping its massive arms around its legs, shivering violently. I stepped back inside and locked the steel door, leaning against it with my heart racing. The image of that massive, wet hand gripping the rail burned into my retinas. I knew I should be terrified, but all I could think about was the cold. It was freezing out there, and I had a cooler full of fresh cod in the kitchen. I stood in the galley kitchen of the lighthouse, staring at the open icebox, my hands hovering over the cooler full of Pacific cod I had caught earlier that week. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize the impossibility of the situation, but the image of that shivering giant on the rocks wouldn't leave me. I wasn't a biologist or a zoologist. I was a father who knew what it looked like when something was cold and afraid. I grabbed 3 large fish, their scales cold and slick against my skin, and walked back to the heavy steel door. I wasn't feeding a monster. I was offering a meal to a shipwrecked soul who had just conquered the ocean. I stepped back out onto the catwalk, the wind trying to rip the fish from my hands, and peered over the railing into the swirling mist. He was still there, curled against the fuel tank, a dark mound of misery in the gray void. I whistled, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the roar of the surf, and his head snapped up. I held up the fish, letting the beam of the lighthouse catch the silver scales, and then tossed them down one by one. They landed with wet slaps on the concrete platform inches from his face. He didn't scramble or snatch. He looked up at me, his eyes reflecting the light, and then slowly reached out. He ate with a desperate, terrifying efficiency, consuming the fish raw, bones and all, in massive bites that spoke of a hunger deep enough to drive a land animal into the sea. I watched him from above, safe behind my iron railing, feeling a strange mixture of revulsion and pity. He finished the meal in seconds, and then licked the oil from his fingers, his gaze returning to the dark water churning below the cliff. He looked exhausted, his reserves depleted, but the food seemed to settle him. He curled back up, pulling his knees tight, and closed his eyes. I stayed on watch until the cold drove me inside, leaving him to the mercy of the rock. When dawn broke, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gray, I rushed back to the gallery deck, expecting to see him still there. But the platform was empty. There was no sign of the giant, no splash in the water, no dark shape bobbing in the swell. He had vanished as silently as he had arrived, slipping back into the ocean before the sun could expose him. I climbed down the ladder to the platform, half convinced I had dreamt the whole thing in a fugue of isolation. But there, stamped in the salt rime and algae, were the prints. Massive, barefoot, 5-toed evidence that the night had been real. For the next 3 months, the rock was silent. I spent every night watch scanning the cliffs and the water, my binoculars pressed to my eyes until they ached, but saw nothing but seals and driftwood. The doubt began to creep in, a subtle poison whispering that grief had finally cracked my mind. I wondered if I had projected my need for connection onto a seal or a shadow, inventing a companion to share the loneliness. The winter storm slammed into the lighthouse, shaking the foundation, and I resigned myself to the idea that I was just another keeper going rock-happy, losing his grip on reality. But on New Year's Eve, 1965, the ocean delivered a receipt. The tide was low, the sea unusually calm, and I went down to the platform to check the crane. There, placed exactly in the center of the concrete slab where I had thrown the fish, was a single abalone shell. It wasn't tossed there by a wave. It was placed, concave side up, shimmering with mother-of-pearl in the moonlight. It was huge, bigger than a dinner plate, a specimen that would have required diving deep into the kelp beds to retrieve. It was a payment, a thank you note left by a ghost. After that, the visits became a pattern, though never a predictable one. He would arrive only on the nights when the fog was thickest, using the weather as a cloak to hide his approach from the mainland. I would hear the scrape of his claws on the basalt, the heavy wet thud of his body hauling out onto the platform. I would throw down fish, sometimes cod, sometimes rockfish, and he would leave behind shells, interesting driftwood, or sometimes just a smooth black river stone that must have come from the mainland. We were trading the currency of our respective worlds, building a commerce of trust. I began to understand the immense physical cost of his visits. He was swimming over a mile through freezing, treacherous currents that were notorious for ripping fishing boats apart. I realized that Tillamook Rock wasn't just a resting spot for him. It was a sanctuary, perhaps the only place on the coast where he felt truly safe from whatever hunted him on land. He was risking hypothermia and drowning just to sit on a cold rock where no one else could reach him. We were both refugees, hiding on a stone pillar in the middle of the sea, separated from the world by a moat of dark water. I never tried to get closer during those first few years, respecting the vertical distance between the catwalk and the platform. I was the man in the tower, and he was the creature of the deep, and that separation kept us both safe. But I spent hours watching him, observing the way he wrung the water from his fur, the way he picked barnacles off his skin, the way he watched the beam of the light sweep overhead. He wasn't a monster. He was a being of profound solitude, existing in the margins of the map where the lines get blurry. By 1967, the dynamic had shifted from wary exchange to a silent appointment. I found myself saving the best of my catch for him, worrying when the seas were too rough for him to make the crossing. He became the anchor of my nights, the only living thing that broke the monotony of the watch. I didn't know his name, or if he even had one, but I knew the rhythm of his breathing and the shape of his shadow. And as the spring of '67 approached, I sensed that he was ready to close the distance, to bridge the gap between the rock and the iron. The dawn of April 14th, 1967, was a rare anomaly in the North Pacific. A morning so still that the ocean looked like a sheet of hammered silver stretching to the horizon. The usual roar of the surf was reduced to a hush, the waves lapping gently against the base of the rock instead of smashing into it. I was out on the lower catwalk with a bucket of red lead paint, tackling the endless job of battling rust on the iron railings. The smell of the paint and the salt air mixed in a way that felt industrial and clean. I was focused on the rhythm of the brush, my back to the sea, when the hair on my neck stood up, that now familiar static charge of being watched. I turned slowly, half expecting to see him down on the platform where he usually waited for food, but he wasn't there. He was standing on a jagged outcrop of basalt just 40 feet away, eye level with the catwalk, much closer than he had ever ventured before. The morning light caught him fully, stripping away the mystery of the fog and revealing the creature in high-definition clarity. He wasn't a shadow or a monster. He was a biological masterpiece. His fur was a patchwork of dark browns and sun-bleached tans, matted with salt but thick and healthy. He stood with a posture that was relaxed but alert, one hand resting on the rock face, steadying himself against the swell. For the first time, I saw his face without the veil of darkness or distance. It was a face that carried the weight of centuries, deep fissures radiating from his eyes, a heavy, protruding brow that shadowed his gaze, and a wide, flat nose that flared as he breathed. But it was his expression that stopped me cold. There was no hunger in it, no animal blankness. It was an expression of profound, weary curiosity mixed with an ancient sadness. He looked like an old sailor who had seen every storm since the beginning of time and was tired of the noise. He was looking at me, then at the paintbrush in my hand, with a look that asked, "Why do you paint the cage?" I lowered the brush, paint dripping onto the iron grating, and just stared back. He didn't ask for food. He didn't look at the crane where I usually lowered the fish. He simply held my gaze, blinking slowly, his chest rising and falling in a deep, rhythmic calm. It felt like an invitation, a silent request to stop doing and start being. I wiped my hands on a rag and leaned against the railing, mirroring his stillness. We stood there for an hour, two sentinels watching the sun burn the mist off the water, sharing the morning watch. Then, he moved. He raised a massive arm, water dripping from his fur, and pointed a thick black finger toward the horizon, slightly to the south. I followed the line of his gesture, squinting against the glare, but saw nothing but open ocean. I looked back at him, confused, but he kept pointing, making a low, grunting sound in his chest. He tapped the air with his finger, insistent. "Look." I raised my binoculars, scanning the quadrant he indicated, searching for a ship or a squall line. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a mile out, the surface of the water erupted. A pod of gray whales was breaching, their massive bodies launching into the air and crashing down in explosions of white water. They were migrating north, moving fast, a spectacle of power that I would have completely missed if I had kept painting. I lowered the glasses, stunned. He wasn't just spotting game. He was sharing beauty. He wanted me to see the life in the ocean, to look past the machinery of the lighthouse and witness the world I was ignoring. He looked at me, gave a single sharp nod, and lowered his arm. Lesson 1. Pay attention. Over the next few years, these lessons became the core of our interaction. He taught me to read the ocean not as a hazard, but as a language. He would show up hours before a storm hit, pacing the rocks and looking at the sky, reacting to the drop in barometric pressure long before my instruments registered the change. If he hauled out and huddled low against the base of the tower, I knew to batten down the hatches because a gale was coming. He was a living weather station, tuned to the frequency of the Pacific, warning me of danger with his body language. He taught me about the currents, too. He would throw a piece of driftwood into the water and watch it swirl, tracking the invisible rivers that ran beneath the surface. He would point to the eddies, making circular motions with his hand, showing me where the riptides were lethal and where the safe channels lay. It was survival information, the kind of knowledge a swimmer needs to stay alive in these waters. I realized with a chill that he had probably watched my daughter's boat that day. He knew the water better than any captain, and he was trying to teach me how not to drown. The dynamic of our relationship shifted from provider and dependent to master and apprentice. I was the one with the technology, the light, and the radio, but he was the one with the wisdom. He knew when the salmon were running before the fishing fleet did. He knew when the seals would haul out to pup. He was integrated into the ecosystem in a way I could never be, a part of the food chain rather than an observer of it. I stopped feeling superior to him and started feeling like a clumsy deaf tourist in his kingdom. By 1970, the silence between us wasn't empty. It was full of information. I could read the set of his shoulders and know if the fishing was poor or if the water was too cold. He could look at me and know if I was sad or tired. We had bypassed the need for spoken language, developing a telepathy of proximity. But even as we grew closer, the world outside was encroaching. I started hearing rumors on the radio about automation, about the Coast Guard modernizing the lights. The clock was ticking on my time at Tillamook Rock, and I had the sinking feeling that he knew it too. By 1970, the isolation of the rock had begun to curdle into a different kind of loneliness, the obsolescence of a man being replaced by a machine. The radio chatter from the mainland had changed tone. The Coast Guard headquarters was buzzing with talk of automation, radar systems, and unmanned beacons. They were calling us legacy assets, a polite way of saying we were dinosaurs waiting for the meteor. I listened to the young officers discuss the efficiency of the new systems, realizing that my exile was no longer voluntary. It was becoming mandatory. I was a keeper of a dying flame, tending a light that no one wanted to pay a human to watch anymore. The creature seemed to sense the shift in my spirit, his visits becoming more frequent and prolonged, as if he knew I needed the company. He stopped waiting for the cover of heavy fog, sometimes hauling out on the rocks in the gray twilight, uncaring if a passing ship saw his silhouette. He would sit on the basalt shelf below the gallery for hours, his back to the stone, simply being present while I worked above. It wasn't about the fish anymore. He would often leave the food I threw down untouched until he was ready to leave. He was there for the communion, offering a silent solidarity to the only other living thing on the rock. There was a comfort in his presence that I couldn't find in the logbooks or the radio. I would lean over the railing, smoking a cigarette, and watch the rise and fall of his massive chest as he slept in the spray. He was the only constant in a world that was trying to erase me, a biological anchor in a shifting sea. I found myself talking to him, my voice carrying over the wind, telling him about Emma, about the grief, about the fear of going back to land. He never reacted overtly, but his ear would twitch, or he would shift his weight, letting me know he was listening to the frequency of my sorrow. The turning point came on a humid, suffocating night in August of 1971, when the air was so heavy it felt like breathing water. The foghorn was bellowing its 2-second blast every minute, a rhythmic concussion that usually kept him away because of the noise. But he was there, huddled miserably against the base of the tower, trying to find shelter from a driving rain that had soaked us both to the bone. I looked down at him, shivering on the wet rock, and looked back at the warmth of the lantern room. The regulations were clear, no unauthorized personnel, but the regulations were written by men who slept in warm beds. I walked down the spiral stairs to the lower level, my heart pounding with the audacity of what I was about to do. I gripped the cold iron wheel of the heavy storm door, the barrier that had separated our worlds for 7 years. With a groan of rusted hinges, I pushed it open, the wind catching it and slamming it against the outer wall. I stood in the opening, the light from the equipment room spilling out into the dark, cutting a yellow rectangle in the rain. I didn't whistle. I just stepped back, leaving the threshold open, an invitation that violated every oath of my service. He hesitated for a long time, peering into the opening with suspicion, smelling the diesel fumes and the grease of the compressors. It was a trap, logically speaking, a metal box that smelled of industry. But he looked at me, standing by the air tanks, and made a decision. He pulled himself up, his massive frame filling the doorway, blocking out the storm. He had to duck low to enter, his shoulders brushing the sides of the frame, bringing the smell of the ocean and wet fur into the sterile world of the machine. He stepped onto the concrete floor, his bare feet leaving wet, massive prints on the painted gray surface. He looked around the equipment room with wide, dilated eyes, taking in the brass gauges, the spinning flywheels, and the maze of pipes. The noise of the compressors was deafening in here, but he didn't cover his ears. He seemed fascinated by the rhythm, the mechanical heartbeat of the lighthouse. He reached out a hand and gently touched the vibration of a copper pipe, feeling the pulse of the air pressure that powered the horn. I closed the door behind him, sealing us in, and the sudden drop in wind noise made the machinery sound even louder. We stood there, a man and a monster in a room full of gears, suspended in a moment that felt like a dream. He walked to the corner of the room, away from the moving parts, and sat down heavily on a pile of canvas drop cloths. He watched me as I checked the oil levels and adjusted the valves, his gaze tracking my hands. He wasn't afraid of the technology. He respected it. He understood that this machine was the reason I was here. That night established a new, secret precedent. He didn't come inside often, only when the weather was truly lethal or the loneliness was too much to bear, but the barrier was broken. We would sit in the equipment room, sharing the warmth of the engines, eating dried beef and listening to the storm hammer against the stone walls. I would read my books, and he would sleep, his snoring blending with the chug of the compressor. It was the most domestic existence I had ever known, a bachelor pad shared with a prehistoric roommate. By 1973, we were inseparable in spirit, if not always in proximity. He was the shadow to my light, the wild counterpart to my structured existence, but the foreshadowing of the end was growing darker. I saw the maintenance crews coming more often, measuring the gallery for new equipment, talking about unmanned efficiency. And he saw it too. He would watch the Coast Guard cutters with a deep rumbling growl in his chest, sensing that the white boats were the harbingers of our separation. We were holding onto the rock with our fingernails, but the tide was rising, and it was bringing a disaster that would test the limits of what I could endure. The catastrophe arrived on a Tuesday in March of 1973, riding the back of a gale-force wind that whipped the sea into a frenzy of whitecaps and foam. I saw the ship on the radar first, a blip moving too fast and too close to the jagged teeth of the reef north of the light. It was the Pacific Fortune, a Liberian flag tanker that was old, rusted, and piloted by a captain trying to cut corners to save fuel. I screamed into the radio, firing flares into the storm to warn them off, but physics and inertia had already decided their fate. The sound of the hull tearing open on the basalt was louder than the thunder, a screaming rent of steel that signaled the death of the coastline. The smell hit us before the oil did, a heavy, suffocating stench of sulfur and tar that overpowered the clean salt air I had breathed for a decade. I stood on the gallery, watching through my binoculars as the black tide began to bleed from the wounded ship, spreading like a necrotic infection across the churning water. It wasn't just a spill. It was a blanket of death moving with the current, heading straight for the breeding grounds of the seals and the seabirds. I felt a helplessness so profound it made my knees weak. I was a guardian of the rock, but I couldn't stop the poison that my own species had unleashed. The creature appeared an hour later, hauling himself up onto the landing platform, his usually pristine fur slicked with a greasy black film. He had swum through the slick to get to me, and the experience had traumatized him in a way the storms never could. He stood there, shivering not from cold but from revulsion, frantically wiping at his arms, trying to scrape the sticky, toxic substance from his skin. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and rimmed with white, letting out a high-pitched keen of distress. He didn't understand what it was. He only knew that the ocean had suddenly turned into a trap. I grabbed a bundle of rags and a bucket of kerosene, rushing down the spiral stairs to the platform, violating safety protocols to help him. I spent the next hour scrubbing the crude oil from his coat, the chemical fumes burning my eyes and throat. He stood still, trembling, letting me clean him, trusting me to remove the stain of humanity from his body. But as I worked, I saw the horror in his eyes as he looked past me at the water. The seals were surfacing, gasping for air, their heads coated in black sludge, dying in confused silence. He broke away from me and rushed to the edge of the platform, reaching down to scoop up a cormorant that had washed onto the rocks. The bird was unrecognizable, a lump of tar with a beak thrashing weakly in his massive hand. He tried to clean it, using his fingers to wipe the oil from its eyes, making soft, cooing sounds of comfort. But the bird died in his grip, suffocated by the very element that was supposed to sustain it. He held the small, limp body for a long time, staring at it with a look of profound, crushing incomprehension. He turned to me then, holding the dead bird out, his expression shifting from sorrow to a terrible, accusing question. He pointed at the tanker, still grinding on the reef, and then at the dead bird, and then at me. "You did this. Not me personally, but my tribe. The makers of the ships and the black blood that powered them." He was showing me the cost of our convenience, the absolute disregard we held for the world he lived in. I stood there, covered in oil, unable to meet his gaze, feeling the weight of every engine and factory on my shoulders. For the next week, the rock became a morgue. Dead fish, birds, and seals washed up in drifts, piling against the base of the lighthouse in a macabre, high-tide line. The creature didn't leave. He stayed on the rocks, pacing back and forth, watching the destruction with a vigilante's intensity. He would pull survivors from the water, bringing them to the higher rocks, trying to save them, but few survived. I watched him mourn, seeing a depth of empathy that shamed the salvage crews who were only worried about the value of the ship's hull. He stopped coming into the lighthouse during this time. He refused to enter the machine room, the place that smelled of diesel and oil, the same substances that were killing his home. He sat outside, huddled in the wind, drawing a line between himself and the technology I represented. The bond we had formed in the equipment room was fractured by the reality of what that equipment cost the Earth. He looked at the Fresnel lens not as a guiding star anymore, but as the eye of the monster that had brought the black tide. I realized then that he wasn't just a witness to nature, he was a judge of character, and humanity had been found wanting. He saw us as a plague, a species that fouled its own nest and killed its neighbors for fuel. The way he looked at me changed. The warmth was replaced by a wary pity, as if he felt sorry that I was attached to such a destructive lineage. He was teaching me that intelligence without wisdom is just a more efficient way to destroy the world. As the cleanup crews finally arrived, spraying dispersants that were just as toxic as the oil, the creature retreated into the shadows of the cliff caves. He couldn't stop it, and I couldn't stop it, so we simply endured it. But the ocean had changed, the smell had changed, and the dynamic between us had shifted permanently. He was no longer looking at me as a teacher, he was looking at me as a warning. And as the oil slick dispersed and the calendar turned to 1975, a new threat appeared on the horizon. Not a ship, but a clipboard carrying the order that would end my watch forever. The order to decommission Tillamook Rock arrived in September of 1975, not via radio, but delivered by a young ensign who hopped off the supply boat with a clipboard and an apologetic smile. He handed me the paperwork that declared my life's work obsolete. The official notice that the station was converting to full automation, effective immediately. I stood on the landing platform, reading the typed words that reduced 12 years of survival to a budget cut, feeling the wind tear at the edges of the paper. They gave me 2 weeks. 2 weeks to dismantle a home, pack up a decade of solitude, and hand the keys over to a computer that didn't need to sleep or eat. The installation crew arrived the next day, a team of technicians in orange coveralls who swarmed the rock like invasive insects. They drilled into the granite I had kept clean, ran cables through the walls I had painted, and installed a cold, electric beacon that hummed with a soulless efficiency. They treated the lighthouse not as a temple of safety, but as a hardware problem to be solved. I watched them strip the soul out of the station, removing the brass fittings and the warmth of the old oil lamps, replacing them with plastic and sensors. To them, I was already a ghost, an artifact standing in the way of progress. The creature vanished during the construction, driven into the deep caves by the noise of the drills and the smell of strangers. I worried he had left for good, abandoning the rock before I could say goodbye. But I would see his shadow at night, watching from the waterline. He was observing the invasion, witnessing the transformation of his sanctuary into a robot. He knew, with an animal's instinct for displacement, that the territory was changing hands. The new light was harsher, whiter, cutting through the fog without the warmth of the old beam, and he hated it. When the technicians finally left, leaving me alone for the final countdown, the silence that returned was heavy and terminal. I spent my days packing my life into cardboard boxes, a surreal process of deciding what to keep and what to throw into the sea. My books, my clothes, the few photos of Emma, they all fit into 3 crates. It was terrifying to realize how little space a human life takes up when you strip away the daily routine. The lighthouse echoed with the emptiness of a house that knows it's being abandoned, the wind whistling through vents that used to be warm. The creature returned on the first night of my final week, hauling himself up to the platform with a heavy, labored slowness. He didn't come for food. He didn't even look at the bucket of fish I had left out. He walked past it and approached the base of the tower, placing his massive hand flat against the stone blocks. He stood there for a long time, eyes closed, feeling the vibration of the new machinery inside. He was saying goodbye to the structure itself, acknowledging the end of the era where the rock was a living thing. He began to pace the perimeter of the station, walking the same circuit I used to walk on my inspections, checking the railings and the glass. It was a ritualistic patrol, a final securing of the perimeter before the guard changed. He looked at the new solar panels and the automated fog sensor with deep suspicion, sniffing the plastic casing and sneezing in disgust. He understood that these machines didn't have a heartbeat, that they wouldn't throw fish or share the silence. The rock was becoming a dead thing, a machine island. We spent the evening sitting on the lower catwalk, our legs dangling over the abyss, watching the sun set on our time together. I talked to him more in those final days than I had in years, pouring out my fears about returning to the mainland. I told him I was afraid of the noise, of the people, of the traffic. I told him I didn't know how to be Thomas Brennan again. I only knew how to be the keeper. He listened, his head resting on his knees, his amber eyes fixed on the horizon. He offered no solution, only the comfort of his presence, a silent reassurance that I had survived the ocean, so I could survive the land. I noticed he was spending more time looking at me than the sea, memorizing my face with a desperate intensity. He would lean in close, studying the lines around my eyes, the shape of my hands, storing the data in a mind that I knew never forgot anything. It was a mutual archiving. I was memorizing the texture of his fur and the smell of the brine on his skin. We were taking mental photographs, preparing for the permanent separation that was rushing toward us like a rogue wave. The hardest realization was the fear for his future. Without me, there would be no food drops in the winter, no warnings about storms, no companionship. He would be alone again, truly alone, facing his declining years on a rock that had turned cold and indifferent. I thought about leaving the door unlocked, leaving him a way in, but I knew the Coast Guard would seal it. I was powerless to protect him after I left. The guilt was a physical pain, a sharp blade twisting in my gut every time I looked at him. On the penultimate night, the weather turned, a gale blowing in from the north that whipped the sea into a frenzy. It was fitting weather for an end. We sat in the equipment room one last time, ignoring the regulations, listening to the wind try to tear the roof off. He didn't sleep. He sat watching the door, his ears twitching at every gust. He knew the timeline. He sensed the finality in the way I had packed the last box. And as the dawn approached, bringing the day the helicopter was scheduled to arrive, he stood up and moved toward the door, ready to deliver the final lesson. I am 91 years old today, trapped in a body that has become a cage of failing organs and brittle bones. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less if the pneumonia comes back, but I don't need their charts to know the tide is going out. My son visits on Sundays, sitting uncomfortably in the plastic chair, urging me to make peace with God or write letters to grandchildren I barely know. He wants me to have a good death, a tidy wrapping up of affairs with a hymnal and a clean conscience. But he doesn't know that my peace was made 40 years ago on a rock in the Pacific, and my conscience is clear only because I kept my mouth shut. For 49 years, I have carried the memory of those encounters like a smooth, heavy stone in my pocket, turning it over in my mind whenever the world got too loud. I never told a soul, not the Coast Guard debriefers, not my wife when I remarried, not the priest at confession. Who would believe that a grieving lighthouse keeper spent 12 years being educated by a creature that science insists is a myth? They would have institutionalized me, locked me away in a room with soft walls and heavy drugs, treating my truth as a symptom of isolation psychosis. Silence was the only way to protect the dignity of what happened out there. But death has a way of loosening the tongue, rendering the fear of ridicule irrelevant against the fear of being forgotten. I look at the ocean from this sterile window, watching the gray waves crash against the jetty, and I realize that when I die, the story dies with me. The history of Tillamook Rock isn't just about storms and shipwrecks. It's about the intersection of two species that were never meant to meet. I owe it to him, to the creature, the giant, the Bigfoot of the deep, to put it on the record. He was a witness to my life, and now I must be a witness to his. I want people to know that we are not the masters of this planet. We are just the loudest tenants. We build our towers and our ships, convinced of our superiority, while things older and wiser than us watch from the shadows with pity. He taught me that humanity is defined not by what we build, but by how we treat the things that are helpless against us. He saw us poison the water with oil, saw us strip the magic from the rock with automation, and he judged us. His silence was a verdict that I have spent 4 decades trying to appeal. I often wonder what happened to him after I left. Did he keep coming to the rock, confused by the cold electric light and the locked doors? Did he swim out in the fog, hauling himself up to the platform, waiting for a fish that never fell? The thought of him sitting there alone, surrounded by machines, breaks my heart more than my own approaching end. I hope he returned to the mainland, to the deep forests of the Coast Range, and found his own kind. I hope he died old and warm, far away from the stink of diesel and the noise of men. The world has changed so much since 1975. There are no more blank spots on the map, no more sanctuaries where a giant can rest. We have satellites that can read a license plate from space and sonar that maps every inch of the ocean floor. I worry that we have squeezed the mystery out of the world, leaving no room for the impossible to exist. But then I look at the storm clouds gathering offshore, the violence of the water that no technology can tame, and I have hope. The ocean is deep, and the woods are dark, and maybe, just maybe, there are still secrets we haven't paved over. I am not afraid of dying. In a way, I have been waiting for it since Emma's boat capsized in 1962. I view death not as an end, but as a return to the fog, a stepping off the gallery into the mist where all lost things eventually go. I like to think that when I cross over, I won't be met by a choir of angels, but by a heavy, wet hand pulling me up onto a rock. I like to think that he will be there, young and strong again, waiting to show me where the whales go in the winter. This confession is my final log entry, the last report of Keeper Thomas Brennan, United States Coast Guard, retired. I am breaking the regulations one last time to report a biological hazard that turned out to be a biological miracle. I'm telling you that Bigfoot isn't just a monster in the woods. He is a swimmer, a sailor, and a friend. He exists. He was there. And he had more humanity in his little finger than most men have in their whole bodies. So, when you look at the lighthouse blinking on the horizon, don't just see a navigation aid. See a temple where a man and a beast shared communion over raw fish in silence. Remember that the boundaries between our worlds are thinner than we think, permeable to those who are broken enough to look through the cracks. I am done now. The tide is coming in, and the lights are dimming in the hallway. It's time for me to go down to the platform and see who is waiting. My son is coming tomorrow to collect my things, to box up a life he never really understood. He will find this recording, or this letter, and he will probably burn it, thinking it's the ramblings of a senile old man. But if you are hearing this, if the truth has found its way to you, then the watch continues. Keep your eyes on the tree line, keep your eyes on the water, and never assume that just because you are alone, you are unobserved. The Keeper is signing off.